The first time I realized the HOA had its eyes on me was a bright Saturday morning, the kind where the sun hits just right, birds are chirping, and the world feels calm. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee in hand, enjoying the small suburban peace I had worked hard for. My house sat neatly on the corner lot, with a modest front yard I had never paid much attention to. To me, grass was just grass. It grew, I mowed it once in a while, and life went on. But to the HOA, it seemed, my lawn was about to become their battleground. Pinned to my front door that morning was a thin white envelope with the HOA's logo stamped at the top. I tore it open, thinking it was just another routine notice. What I read instead made me laugh at first, and then slowly boil with frustration. The letter stated that my lawn had been deemed unacceptable, citing grass that was uneven in length and inconsistent in color. They demanded that I mow, fertilize, and reseed within 7 days or face a $500 fine. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke. My lawn wasn't perfect, sure, but it wasn't dead, patchy, or overgrown. It was just normal. A yard like any other in the neighborhood. Yet here I was, holding a letter written with the stern authority of a judge handing down a sentence. The tone wasn't a friendly reminder. It was a threat. That weekend, I tried to brush it off. I told myself I'd mow and be done with it. But something about the letter bothered me deeply. It wasn't just about grass. It was about control. About someone on the HOA board, someone who had too much time on their hands, deciding that they had power over how I lived on my own property. And sure enough, the situation escalated faster than I expected. By Tuesday, another letter arrived, this one stamped in bold red ink. Final warning. The HOA claimed that an inspector had driven by and determined my lawn still wasn't in compliance. Never mind that I had mowed it 2 days earlier. They didn't care. They wanted their $500. The next HOA meeting was that Thursday, and I knew I had to attend. The meeting room was crowded, filled with neighbors who looked just as annoyed as I felt. At the head of the table sat the HOA president, a sharp-eyed woman named Deborah, though everyone in the neighborhood quietly referred to her as the Queen Bee. She thrived on her position, treating it as if she were running a miniature kingdom where every blade of grass was her subject. As the meeting went on, I noticed the pattern. Complaints about fences being 2 inches too high, cars parked facing the wrong direction, mailboxes that weren't painted the exact approved shade of beige. It wasn't about improving the neighborhood. It was about enforcing arbitrary rules and collecting fines. And now, I was their latest target. When my lawn issue was brought up, Deborah wasted no time in shaming me publicly. She spoke as if my yard was a disgrace to the entire subdivision, as if the sight of slightly uneven grass was going to drive down property values across the block. People nodded along, some out of agreement, others just to avoid being the next victim. I sat there quietly, letting her finish her tirade. But in my mind, I was already plotting. I could have caved. I could have reseeded, fertilized, and pampered my lawn like it was some kind of prize-winning show dog. I could have written the $500 check just to make the problem disappear. But the more Deborah talked, the more I realized that giving in would only make things worse. That night, as I lay awake in bed, a wild idea began to take shape. If they wanted to nitpick my lawn, fine. But I wasn't going to give them what they wanted. I was going to do the exact opposite. Instead of trimming my grass into submission, I was going to transform my entire yard into something they couldn't control, something bigger, louder, and completely out of their reach. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew the seed of rebellion had been planted. The following weekend, I drove to the local nursery. I wandered the aisles, not for lawn seed or fertilizer, but for something entirely different. I bought towering tropical plants, creeping vines, and thick shrubs that would grow fast and wild. I bought soil, mulch, and planters, filling the back of my truck until it looked like I was opening a small rainforest exhibit. When I returned home, Neighbors peeked out their windows, curious about what I was doing. I unloaded plant after plant, carrying them across my lawn with a smile. Some neighbors asked cautiously if I was starting a garden. Others just shook their heads, probably assuming I had lost my mind. But I knew exactly what I was doing. Over the next week, I worked tirelessly. I dug up the old grass and replaced it with rich, dark soil. I planted towering ferns, thick banana leaves, and flowering vines that twisted upward like they had a mind of their own. I created winding stone paths, layered mulch, and placed bright tropical blooms at every corner. By the time I was done, my lawn didn't look like a lawn at all. It looked like a jungle. The transformation was stunning. Where there had once been an ordinary patch of suburban grass, there was now a vibrant explosion of greenery, color, and life. Birds flocked to the branches, butterflies danced around the flowers, and the sound of rustling leaves filled the air every time the wind blew. It wasn't a yard anymore. It was an ecosystem. And I loved it. Of course, I knew the HOA wouldn't see it that way. And I was right. Within 2 days, another letter arrived, this one even more aggressive than before. They claimed my yard was now in gross violation of community standards, that it was an unsightly jungle attracting pests, and that I had 30 days to remove it or face escalating fines. But instead of fear, I felt satisfaction. My jungle had rattled them. My rebellion was working. What they saw as a nuisance, I saw as freedom, and this was only the beginning. Because what I had started was no longer just about me or my lawn. It was about standing up to the HOA, about showing my neighbors that they didn't have to live under the constant thumb of nitpicking tyrants. My jungle was a statement, a challenge, and a declaration all in one. As I stood at the edge of my yard that night, looking at the lush greenery swaying in the moonlight, I knew the battle with the HOA was far from over. But for the first time, I felt ready. The queen bee thought she had stung me, but she was about to learn that I had teeth. The morning after my jungle reached its full form, the neighborhood felt different. People slowed down as they passed my house, some smiling in admiration, others shaking their heads in disapproval. Children pointed and laughed at the oversized banana leaves and towering ferns that brushed against the sidewalk. To them, it was a fantasy land. To me, it was freedom. But to the HOA, it was war. I didn't have to wait long before they made their next move. A week later, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox. It wasn't just a warning this time. It was a formal notice of violation, written in dense, legalistic language, the kind designed to intimidate. They declared that my property was no longer in compliance with the uniform aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. They claimed that the unsanctioned foliage I had introduced created a visual disruption. And of course, they demanded immediate removal or face not only fines but also potential legal action. For a moment, I felt the weight of their words. The thought of legal battles, escalating fines, and drawn-out disputes with a board that had deep pockets and endless time was daunting. They thrived on the idea that homeowners like me would crumble under the pressure. But the truth was, the more they pushed, the more resolved I became. The next HOA meeting was already circled on my calendar. I walked into that room with my head high, knowing exactly what I had done and why I had done it. Deborah, the queen bee herself, sat at the head of the table, eyes burning with disapproval. Around her sat the other board members, stiff-backed and serious, as though they were deciding matters of state instead of obsessing over someone's front yard. When my case was brought up, the board members leaned into their microphones, speaking about community integrity and property values. They painted my jungle as a threat to everything they stood for, claiming it would drive buyers away and invite chaos. To hear them tell it, my yard was practically the downfall of civilization itself. But what they didn't expect was how many neighbors quietly admired what I had done. I caught glimpses of them nodding when the board complained, not in agreement with the HOA, but in recognition of what I had dared to do. My jungle wasn't just a yard anymore. It was a symbol of resistance. It was proof that someone could stand up to the endless nitpicking and win back a little bit of freedom. Deborah, however, wasn't about to let that symbol grow unchecked. She announced that the board had voted to issue me a $500 fine, with an additional $50 added for every day I refused to remove the plants. It was a punishment designed to bleed me dry, to force me into submission not through reason, but through exhaustion and cost. I returned home that night with the fine notice in hand, staring at the numbers printed in bold. The smart thing to do would have been to back down, but I couldn't. The more they threatened, the more determined I became to hold my ground. And then, an idea came to me. An idea bigger than just resisting. If they thought my jungle was a problem now, they hadn't seen anything yet. The very next day, I expanded. I bought more plants, more vines, more flowers, too, had spilled out in waves of color. I created shaded alcoves, layered rock formations, and a small pond with water lilies. The birds multiplied, butterflies swarmed, and my yard buzzed with life in ways no sterile, manicured lawn ever could. Soon, my jungle wasn't just a curiosity, it was an attraction. Neighbors I had never spoken to before came by to see it. Kids loved to explore the winding paths. Even people from outside the neighborhood started driving by, curious about the house with the jungle yard. I heard laughter, joy, and awe. It was everything the HOA claimed to stand for: beauty, uniqueness, vibrancy. But it was happening outside their rigid control, and that was what truly enraged them. The HOA doubled down. More letters arrived, each one more aggressive than the last. They accused me of harboring pests, even though no one had seen a single rodent or insect infestation. They claimed my jungle obstructed sightlines, even though I had carefully planted everything to remain within property lines and city codes. Their accusations became less about fact and more about fear of losing control. Then came the inspections. Board members began showing up at random times, clipboards in hand, peering over my fence, jotting notes like I was some kind of criminal. Deborah herself came by one afternoon, standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed, staring at my yard as though she could burn it down with her glare alone. But the more they hovered, the more it backfired. Because while they obsessed, the neighborhood started talking. Whispers of discontent spread. People who had once silently endured fines for mailboxes and paint shades now began to question why the HOA had so much power. Some even asked me how I did it, how I stood up without folding. What started as my personal rebellion was becoming something larger, something that hinted at real change. Of course, and the HOA noticed this shift too, and that only made them more desperate. A few days later, I received their boldest move yet, a bayonnaise, formal notice of intent to sue. They claimed my yard violated the Architectural Harmony Clause in the bylaws, a vague rule that gave them the ability to attack almost anything they didn't like. It was clear they wanted to make an example of me, to show everyone else what happened if you dared to challenge their authority. For the first time, the weight of the battle pressed down on me. A lawsuit was serious. It wasn't just about plants anymore. It was about lawyers, courts, and costs that could spiral out of control. The HOA thought this would finally break me. But instead, something unexpected happened. When I shared the notice with a few neighbors, they didn't react with pity. They reacted with anger. They saw the lawsuit for what it was: bullying. And slowly, people began offering to help. Some suggested fundraising. Others mentioned legal contacts who hated HOAs just as much as we did. My fight was no longer mine alone. It was becoming the neighborhood's fight. Standing in the middle of my jungle one evening, as the sun dipped low and the leaves glowed in shades of gold, I realized I had crossed a line. There was no turning back. The HOA thought they could scare me into submission, but what they had done instead was awaken a resistance. The queen bee had declared war, but she had underestimated just how strong the hive around me had become. And as I folded the lawsuit notice back into its envelope, I knew the next phase of the battle was about to begin. The notice of intent to sue felt heavier than the paper it was printed on. Thick, stamped, and worded in cold legal language, it carried the weight of intimidation. That was the HOA's strategy. Overwhelm homeowners with fear, bury them in paperwork, and watch them cave. For years, it had worked. People would pay the fines, repaint their shutters, cut down their trees, or simply give up. The HOA thrived on that sill. But as I held the notice in my hands, standing in the middle of my jungle, I realized silence was no longer an option. The first step was research. I pulled out the HOA's bylaws, the dense, confusing document no one ever read until it was too late. Flipping through its pages, I found the infamous architectural harmony clause they were using against me. It was vague, intentionally so, stating that all properties must maintain a uniform appearance consistent with community standards. In other words, if the board didn't like something, they could call it a violation. That clause was their weapon, but it was also their weakness. Vague rules don't hold up well under scrutiny, especially when applied selectively. Because as I looked around the neighborhood, I noticed dozens of violations that had been ignored. A neighbor with bright blue shutters, another with a lawn full of ornamental statues, a third who had left a broken fence leaning for months without a fine. It was selective enforcement, plain and simple, and selective enforcement was something courts didn't like. But I wasn't going to face this alone. The whispers of support from my neighbors after the last HOA meeting began to turn into something stronger. People stopped me on the street, not just to admire the jungle, but to voice their frustration. They told me about fines they had paid, ridiculous rules they had endured, and how tired they were of living under Deborah's iron grip. My yard had become more than plants. It was a banner, and the people were rallying to it. One evening, my neighbor across the street, a quiet man named Thomas who had lived in the subdivision for 20 years, came over with a folder. Inside were his old violation notices, some dating back over a decade. He told me he had paid thousands in fines over the years for trivial things, leaving his trash cans out an hour too long, planting G roses instead of approved shrubs, even repainting his garage door because Deborah decided the beige wasn't beige enough. His folder was a record of the HOA's tyranny, and now he wanted me to use it. Word spread, and soon more neighbors shared their stories. Letters, fines, notices, all carefully kept as proof. I began building a case without even trying. It wasn't just about my jungle anymore. It was about the years of abuse that had piled up under the HOA's watch. And Deborah, in her arrogance, hadn't realized that by targeting me so aggressively, she had sparked a rebellion. Still, the HOA pressed forward. A week later, I received the official summons. They were suing me in small claims court, seeking not only the fines but also reimbursement for their legal fees. Their argument was simple. My yard violated the bylaws, and therefore I was in breach of contract. It sounded neat and tidy on paper, but real life was never that simple. Preparing for the court date, I reached out to a local attorney who specialized in property disputes. To my surprise, when I explained the situation, he smiled and said he had been waiting for someone to take on Deborah's HOA for years. He had already represented homeowners in nearby neighborhoods against similar overreaching boards, and he knew the tricks they used. He agreed to represent me for a reduced fee, explaining that if we won, the court could force the HOA to pay costs anyway. For the first time, the playing field felt level. The weeks leading up to the hearing were tense. The HOA didn't back down. In fact, they escalated their smear campaign. They circulated newsletters claiming my jungle was lowering property values. They accused me of harboring dangerous wildlife, pointing to a neighbor who swore they saw a raccoon in my yard one evening. They even filed a noise complaint, claiming the birds attracted by my plants were disturbing the peace. It was laughable, but it was also exhausting. They weren't just attacking my yard anymore. They were attacking my character. But the neighborhood was no longer fooled. Every attempt to discredit me only drew more people to my side. Families brought their kids to take photos in front of the jungle. A local blogger even wrote about it, calling my yard a suburban sanctuary and criticizing the HOA for crushing individuality. Suddenly, the fight wasn't just within the neighborhood, it was gaining attention outside it, and Deborah hated that more than anything. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was small, just a county facility, but it was packed. Neighbors filled the benches, some to support me, others just curious to see the showdown. Deborah arrived with 2 other board members, dressed stiffly and carrying binders thick with documents. They looked confident, as if they had already won. I sat at the defendant's table with my attorney, calm but resolute. The HOA presented their case first. Deborah spoke at length about community standards, reading from the bylaws and emphasizing the need for uniformity. She painted my jungle as an outrageous violation, a disruption, and even an eyesore. She spoke with conviction, as though she believed every word, and I could see the smugness in her face as she finished. Then it was our turn. My attorney stood and began dismantling their arguments piece by piece. He pointed out the vagueness of the clause they cited. He showed photos of other properties with clear violations that had gone unpunished. He introduced the stack of old violation letters from neighbors showing the pattern of selective enforcement. And then, the highlight. He presented testimony from neighbors who spoke about the beauty of the jungle, how it brought joy to the community, and how the HOA's actions were rooted not in protecting values but in enforcing control. As the judge listened, Deborah's confidence began to crack. Her jaw tightened, her eyes darted, and she scribbled lead notes furiously as each piece of evidence chipped away at her case. By the time my attorney finished, the courtroom no longer felt like it belonged to her. It belonged to us. The judge didn't make a ruling that day, choosing instead to review the evidence and issue a written decision. But as I walked out of the courtroom, surrounded by neighbors who clapped me on the back and whispered words of encouragement, I knew the tide had shifted. The lawsuit wasn't just about my yard anymore. It was about the entire community standing up to years of bullying. And whether we won or lost, one thing was certain. The HOA would never rule unchallenged again. That night, as I stood in my jungle under the glow of the porch light, I felt a quiet strength. The fight was far from over, but the HOA had underestimated me. They thought they could bury me under fines and fear. Instead, they had planted something they could never control, and the roots of that resistance were spreading. The weeks after the court hearing felt like living in limbo. Every day I checked the mailbox with a strange mix of dread and anticipation, waiting for the judge's decision. The jungle outside my home continued to thrive, greener and louder than ever. Vines stretched higher, blooms exploded in color, and birdsong filled the mornings like a natural orchestra. To me, it was a daily reminder of why I was fighting. To the HOA, it was a daily insult, a reminder that I hadn't yet been broken. Neighbors kept stopping by, offering words of encouragement. Some brought old violation notices to add to the growing pile of evidence we had amassed, while others simply came to walk the paths I had laid through the greenery. Children still treated it like their own secret adventure park, laughing as they darted between the tall leaves. For many, my yard had become more than a spectacle. It had become a refuge, a reminder that life didn't have to be as bland and sterile as Deborah wanted it to be. But as supportive as the neighborhood was, I couldn't shake the uncertainty. Courts had a way of surprising people. Judges could lean heavily toward HOAs, seeing them as the keepers of order rather than the bullies they often were. The longer the decision took, the more my mind wandered through scenarios. Heavy fines, forced removal of the jungle, even foreclosure if they pushed hard enough. Deborah wanted nothing more than to make me the cautionary tale that scared everyone else back into silence. Finally, 3 weeks later, the letter arrived. A plain white envelope, no different from the dozens of notices that had come before it. But this time, it wasn't from the HOA. It was from the court. My hands shook slightly as I tore it open, the edges ripping unevenly. Inside was the decision I had been waiting for. The judge had ruled in my favor. The ruling was clear. The HOA's enforcement of the Architectural Harmony Clause was arbitrary and selectively applied. My yard, while unconventional, did not violate any explicit city codes or safety regulations. Furthermore, the court noted the overwhelming evidence of the HOA's inconsistent treatment of homeowners, citing the many examples of ignored violations throughout the neighborhood. The fines they had levied against me were declared void, and the HOA was ordered to pay my legal fees. I read the words again and again, hardly believing them. Relief washed over me like a wave, followed quickly by a surge of triumph. The HOA hadn't just lost, they had been exposed. When word spread through the neighborhood, the reaction was electric. Neighbors stopped by with smiles and congratulations. Some cheered openly in the street, no longer afraid of Deborah's glare. The jungle, once seen as a curiosity or even a nuisance, was now celebrated as the yard that beat the HOA. But the ruling did more than free me from their grasp. It cracked Deborah's facade. For years she had ruled with fear, but now the court had shown that her power wasn't absolute. That realization emboldened others. Soon, whispers began turning into plans. Homeowners who had long wanted to make changes but held back began talking about painting their houses new colors, adding gardens, or building small improvements they had once been told weren't allowed. The verdict didn't just protect my jungle, it planted seeds of rebellion all over the subdivision. Deborah, of course, did not take the loss gracefully. She doubled down, sending out newsletters filled with stern language about protecting community values and warning residents not to mistake one case for a free pass. But the fear her words once carried was gone. People rolled their eyes, laughed, and went about their lives. The power had shifted, and she knew it. Still, I wasn't naive. The HOA wouldn't give up so easily. The verdict had humiliated them, and humiliation breeds resentment. I expected retaliation, and I didn't have to wait long for it. Within weeks, they introduced new proposals at the monthly meeting, amendments to the bylaws that would create stricter definitions of acceptable landscaping, new rules for excessive foliage, and even restrictions on non-traditional yard designs. It was a transparent attempt to rewrite the rules specifically to target me. But this time, something incredible happened. The room didn't stay silent. Neighbors who had once sat quietly, afraid of being singled out, began speaking up. They pointed out the hypocrisy of targeting me while ignoring other issues. They questioned the need for such strict control when property values were rising regardless, and some openly accused Deborah of abusing her position. For the first time, the board faced real pushback. Watching it unfold, I felt a sense of pride. My fight hadn't just been about saving my jungle. It had woken people up. The HOA wasn't some untouchable authority anymore. It was a group of neighbors, and neighbors could be challenged, voted out, or replaced. The weeks that followed were some of the most interesting I had ever experienced in the neighborhood. My jungle thrived, not just as a yard, but as a gathering place. Families took evening walks just to stop by. People brought folding chairs to sit under the shade of the taller plants. A few even asked me for advice on starting their own gardens, no longer afraid to try something outside the HOA's rigid mold. But with every smile, every compliment, and every small act of defiance I inspired, I knew Deborah's anger was growing. Her letters became harsher, her demeanor colder, her desperation more obvious. She had lost the battle in court, but in her mind, The war wasn't over. She wanted her control back, and she was willing to claw for it. One evening, as I watered the plants along the edge of the sidewalk, I noticed her walking past, her eyes locked on my yard with a look that was equal parts disgust and fury. For a brief moment, our eyes met, and I could see it. She wasn't just angry at the jungle. She was angry at what it represented: freedom, individuality, defiance, all the things she couldn't stand. And that's when I realized the fight wasn't truly about plants at all. It was about power. My jungle had stripped hers away, and she wasn't going to rest until she found a way to take it back. For now, though, I had won. The court had spoken, the neighborhood was awakening, and the jungle was alive and well. But in the back of my mind, I knew this was only a chapter in a much larger story. Deborah wasn't finished, and neither was I. The HOA had struck, the court had ruled, and the neighborhood was changing. But as the sun set over my jungle, painting the leaves in shades of orange and gold, I couldn't help but wonder, what would Deborah do next? The court verdict should have been the end of it. Logic said the HOA would lick its wounds, accept defeat, and move on. But Deborah was not the kind of person who let go easily. To her, the ruling wasn't just a loss. It was a humiliation, a personal blow to her pride. And when prideful people lose power, they don't retreat. They plot. At first, her revenge was subtle. The newsletters continued, filled with exaggerated warnings about unruly landscapes and potential hazards. She never mentioned me by name, but everyone knew who she meant. Every paragraph dripped with venom, carefully wrapped in the language of community concern. It was almost amusing at first, but I knew better than to laugh for long. Deborah wasn't the type to stop at words. Soon, her tactics escalated. Strange complaints began trickling in. One week, I received a notice about excessive noise, the supposed offense. Birds singing in my yard at sunrise. Another week, it was unauthorized water features because of the small pond I had built. Then, accusations of attracting pests again, despite city inspectors confirming my property was clean. Each notice was flimsy, but each carried the implied threat of fines, hearings, and more fights. It was harassment by paperwork. A slow grind meant to wear me down, to chip away at my patience until I finally gave up and surrendered. But the thing Deborah didn't understand was that I had already gone through the worst of it. The jungle wasn't just plants anymore. It was a fortress, and I wasn't leaving it undefended. What Deborah didn't anticipate was the way the neighborhood was changing around her. My victory in court had emboldened others. People began to push back, not just against the HOA, but against her personally. At the next monthly meeting, a group of homeowners stood together, questioning the board's priorities. Why were they wasting so much time and money on personal vendettas when real community improvements were ignored? Why were dues being funneled into legal battles instead of repairs? The questions landed like blows, and for the first time, Deborah looked rat and led. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. Her next move was bolder, more dangerous. One morning I stepped outside to find the jungle disturbed. Plants trampled, a stone path overturned. A section of the pond drained as though someone had deliberately punctured the liner. It wasn't an accident. Someone had trespassed in the night, tearing through my sanctuary like a vandal. My stomach dropped as I surveyed the damage. This wasn't paperwork anymore. This was physical. I couldn't prove Deborah had anything to do with it, but the timing was too perfect. The message too clear. If she couldn't beat me with fines and lawsuits, she'd try to break me by force. Instead of caving, I called in reinforcements. Neighbors rallied immediately. Thomas, the quiet man with the folder of old violation notices, brought tools and helped me repair the pond. A family down the street brought new plants to replace the ones that had been destroyed. Children picked up stones and branches, eager to help rebuild. In a single weekend, we not only repaired the damage, but expanded the jungle even further. What had been an act of sabotage turned into another moment of unity, and Deborah's attempt to intimidate me backfired spectacularly. That week, the jungle drew more visitors than ever. Cars slowed down, people stopped to take photos, and even a local newspaper picked up the story, framing it as a battle between individuality and control. The headline read, "Homeowner's Jungle Yard Survives HOA Attack." The attention embarrassed Deborah even more, turning her personal vendetta into public ridicule. But humiliation only made her angrier. Her next move was her boldest yet. She tried to rewrite the rules entirely. At the following HOA meeting, she introduced a sweeping amendment proposal. New landscaping rules, bans on non-traditional foliage, strict limits on height, color, and density of plants. It was, in essence, a law against my jungle. If passed, it would make everything I had built illegal overnight. The room buzzed with tension as she presented it, her voice sharp and commanding. She tried to frame it as necessary for community cohesion and property values, but everyone could see it for what it was, a personal attack disguised as policy. The vote was set for the following month, and Deborah made it clear she intended to win. She canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, twisting arms, using fear tactics about declining home values. But this time, she was facing more than just me. She was facing a neighborhood that had begun to awaken. In the weeks leading up to the vote, neighbors organized quietly. Conversations happened in driveways, over fences, at backyard barbecues. People who had never cared about HOA politics suddenly cared a lot. They remembered the fines, the nitpicking, the years of control. They remembered how Deborah had ruled with an iron fist, and now they had a chance to push back. On the night of the vote, the community hall was packed. More homeowners showed up than anyone could remember, many holding proxies for neighbors who couldn't attend. Deborah sat at the front, flanked by her loyal board members, confident that fear and apathy would still carry the day. She called the meeting to order with her usual authority, but the air in the room was different. When the proposal was read aloud, the backlash was immediate. Homeowners stood up one after another, voicing their opposition. They spoke about the jungle as a symbol of freedom. They spoke about years of harassment and bullying. They spoke about wanting a neighborhood where people could enjoy their homes without living in fear of a fine for every small detail. The vote came, and the result was decisive. The proposal failed, by a wide margin. Deborah's face was stone as the results were read. She had overplayed her hand, and now her grip on the neighborhood was slipping. But as I walked home that night through the warm air, surrounded by neighbors who clapped me on the back and celebrated the victory, I knew it wasn't over yet. Deborah was cornered, and a cornered animal is the most dangerous. She had lost the lawsuit. She had failed to rewrite the rules. She had been humiliated publicly, and now even her allies were starting to distance themselves. And in that moment, I realized something unsettling. If she couldn't beat me through the system, she might try to destroy me outside of it. The jungle was thriving, the neighborhood was changing, and Deborah was losing. But her revenge wasn't finished. It was only about to reach its breaking point. The night after Deborah's proposal collapsed, the neighborhood felt different. For the first time in years, there was a sense of relief in the air, as though the weight of the HOA's endless nitpicking had been lifted, even if only a little. People lingered outside longer, chatting on sidewalks, laughing more freely. My jungle stood tall at the center of it all, no longer just my defiance, but the community's emblem of change. But I knew better than to believe Deborah was finished. Her power was slipping, and with each failed attempt to crush me, her desperation grew. The newsletters became angrier, her speeches more erratic. She stopped hiding her contempt behind polite phrases, instead lashing out openly at those who undermine the order of our community. Everyone knew she meant me. The HOA meetings, once carefully controlled performances, began to unravel. Homeowners questioned every expense, every decision, every fine. Deborah was on the defensive, and she hated it. And then, the final act of her revenge arrived, not with a letter, not with a vote, but with destruction. It happened late one night. I was asleep when I heard the sound, sharp, deliberate, unnatural. Not the rustling of leaves, or the chirping of crickets, but the crack of branches breaking, the crash of stone being overturned. My heart pounded as I rushed to the window, and what I saw made my stomach drop. Figures, 2 of them, moving quickly through my yard with flashlights. Saboteurs, tearing at plants, stomping through flower beds, ripping up vines with gloved hands. One carried a spray can, leaving streaks of paint across the stone paths I had carefully laid. It was a coordinated attack, not random vandalism. I grabbed my phone, snapped photos from the window, and dialed the police. By the time they arrived, the vandals were gone, leaving behind a trail of destruction. Whole sections of the jungle were flattened. My pond had been filled with garbage. Several of the larger plants had been hacked down with shears. It wasn't just damage, it was desecration, meant to send a message. Give up, or we'll keep coming. The officers took my report, reviewed the photos, and promised to investigate. And though I couldn't prove Deborah herself was behind it, the suspicion hung heavy in the air. The timing, the precision, the sheer malice, it all pointed in one direction. The next morning, neighbors gathered at my house staring at the wreckage in disbelief. Some were angry, others heartbroken. But what struck me most was their determination. No one suggested I give up. No one told me to let it go. Instead, they brought shovels, tools, and plants. One by one, they rolled up their sleeves and set to work. That weekend, my yard became a hive of activity. Families worked side by side, children carrying small pots of flowers, adults hauling mulch and soil. People donated new plants, some even ordering exotic species online to replace what had been destroyed. The laughter, the sweat, the unity. It was unlike anything the neighborhood had ever experienced. And by Sunday evening, the jungle was not only restored, it was bigger, brighter, and stronger than before. What Deborah had tried to destroy had only grown. Her attack had backfired again, igniting a spirit of togetherness that no law, suit, or bylaw could smother. My jungle was no longer mine alone. It belonged to everyone who had fought for it, rebuilt it, and defended it. And then the real blow came, not from me, but from the community itself. At the next HOA meeting, the room was packed beyond capacity. For the first time, homeowners who had never attended before filled the seats, standing along the walls, determined to be heard. Deborah tried to start the meeting as usual, her voice sharp and commanding, but she was drowned out by questions. Why had dues been wasted on lawsuits? Why had repairs to common areas been delayed while funds were funneled into petty battles? Why had the board ignored vandalism reports, safety concerns, and maintenance requests? The pressure mounted, and Deborah snapped. Her composure cracked in front of everyone as she ranted about disorder and those who refused to follow the rules. Her mask was gone, replaced by raw bitterness, and the room saw her for what she was, not a leader, but a tyrant clinging to fading power. Then came the motion that changed everything. A group of homeowners formally called for a vote to remove her as president. The bylaws allowed it, though it had never been attempted before. Deborah tried to stop it, shouting about procedure, but it was too late. The room erupted into ballots and raised hands, and when the count was finished, the result was undeniable. Deborah was out. The cheers that followed shook the hall. Years of pent-up frustration poured out in applause, laughter, and relief. Deborah gathered her papers with trembling hands, her face pale and furious, and stormed out without a word. She never returned to another meeting. In the weeks that followed, the HOA changed. The new leadership was made up of homeowners who had grown tired of control and wanted a return to common sense. The endless nitpicking stopped. Fines dwindled. Repairs finally happened. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a community instead of a battlefield. My jungle remained, standing tall as a reminder of what had been fought for and won. It continued to grow, lush and wild, but now it was joined by new gardens, fresh paint colors, and small touches of individuality that began appearing in other yards. The neighborhood became more vibrant, more alive, no longer shackled by uniformity. Sometimes I would catch myself standing at the edge of my yard, watching the sunlight filter through the leaves, and think back to that first letter. The $500 fine. The threat. The beginning of it all. What had started as a punishment had grown into a movement, one that toppled a tyrant and gave people their freedom back. Deborah thought she could crush me with her rules, her fines, and her control. Instead, she planted the seed of her own downfall. And in the end, the jungle won. It didn't just win for me. It won for everyone.